So in this episode, guys, we're going to be talking about how to reduce your risk of a second injury after returning to sport following ACL rehab. So rehabbing from an ACL tear is a long, grueling process, as we know. The real challenge comes when you try to return to your sport once you have completed the full rehab process, which typically is around 9 to 12 months. So it's a long period of time. But the real challenge is when you actually go back to your sport. And the risk of a second injury can be significant if you haven't gone through a criteria-based rehab process. And studies show that 30% of athletes who return to high-level sport suffer another knee injury within 2 years, which is a significant number of people. And we don't want to be going through that same process all over again. So we really want to try to reduce this risk. If you don't take the right steps, you could risk re-injury for a number of reasons. One, it could be the same side gets injured again. It could be a tear of the graft. It could be an injury to the opposite limb because there's a asymmetry that's emerged as you focus so much attention on increasing the strength of the injured side. Actually, the other leg now becomes the weakness. Or it could be simply that you've missed steps in the rehab process and there's really big gaps in what you can do, and therefore it emerges later on in your sport and you risk another injury. But there are proven ways to reduce the risk of re-injury and return to play. Now, following the right approach can build strength, restore balance, and protect the knee for the long term. But many athletes rush this process. Returning too soon and without meeting key recovery milestones is one of the biggest problems of all. So trying to rush this process, not going through it properly, and trying to go back far too soon without hitting some really key milestones. Now, most athletes actually don't have a clue what those milestones are, which is one of the biggest problems of all, simply not knowing what the plan is. When you've got a plan, it's much, much easier. You know what you're working towards, you know what each phase goals are, and when you're going to reach those goals, what criteria you need to hit. And then for once you've hit those criteria, you can progress forwards. Gives you a very clear roadmap. But this puts you at serious risk if you don't know what those key criteria are. So here's why so many athletes re-tear their ACL. Number one, many athletes fail to stay injury-free because they make one or more of these common mistakes. So the first one is, obviously we said, returning to sport too soon. Research shows that each month delay in return to sport reduces re-injury risk by 50%. And there's usually a 9-month minimum we should be aiming for a safe and effective return to sport. So in other words, for every month you delay that return by, you're going to begin to reduce that risk by 50%, which obviously becomes exponential. If we're looking to return at, say, 5 months, then there's an absolutely enormous risk. Whereas if we can delay that by 9 months, 10 months, we're going to massively reduce the risk. Now, on the flip side to that, just having a time-based criteria isn't enough. It's important that we have both your time-based target to aim for of 9 months and specific criteria we should be aiming to achieve as well, which we'll touch on in just a second. The second thing is neglecting quadricep strength. One of the biggest risk factors for second injury is an asymmetry in quadricep strength, or not having quadricep strength of a necessary standard. In alignment with that, it might be that you're strong enough, but you can't produce the force fast enough. And that's the second key factor we should be focused on. Asymmetrical quad strength leads to poor knee control and higher injury risk for a number of reasons. First of all, it could be that if you've got an asymmetry, you're going to rely too much on the other limb. You might have increased risk because the knee joint itself isn't going to be as stable, and you're going to put higher risk on that injured side simply because you can't tolerate the forces that the sport's demanding of you and the rate at which that force is going to have to be produced. Think about trying to change direction quickly in a team-based sport. If your quadriceps aren't strong enough eccentrically to tolerate those demands and deceleration, then you're going to increase exponentially the risk of re-injury. And the next thing is skipping functional testing. We've got to make sure we're testing our body, not just in terms of what the knee joint itself can do, but actually our body's function through the whole kinetic chain. What can it actually do? And skipping this is one of the biggest risk factors of all, because if we can't do the things which we need functionally to be able to do on the pitch, there's no chance we're going to be able to do that without putting ourselves at significant risk. Many athletes return to play without passing key tests like hop tests and strength symmetry assessments as well. So I've got to make sure we have this very clear criteria-driven process. Ignoring movement mechanics is another key thing. Oftentimes we can hit strength criteria, we can hit functional assessments, but actually the basic movement patterns of our body just aren't good enough. So we've got to make sure that our movement mechanics are really, really dialed in. And if there's issues biomechanically in how we are squatting, jumping, landing, changing direction, and then we can see a noticeable difference on one side versus the other, again, that puts risk on the knee and also on the other contralateral limb as well. Poor landing, cutting, and pivoting mechanics do increase the risk of ACL failure. In other words, if you go back, you've done the full rehab process, but your landing mechanics are very, very poor still, then your alignment of your body is going to be really, really poor. and that's going to put you at increased risk as well. So making sure that we can land safely, cut and change direction safely, pivot effectively is all going to help to reduce the risk of that injury. So we can combine functional testing, quadricep strength, and effective mechanics, that's going to massively reduce the risk of another injury. And finally, it's lack of sport-specific preparation. Just going through a generic rehab protocol isn't necessarily going to prepare you for the demands of the specific sport that you play. An example of this is I'm currently working with a goalkeeper in hockey who has had an ACL tear. If we took her through the same protocol and did the same things at end stage that everybody else was doing, you just wouldn't be prepared for the demands of goalkeeping, which is what caused the injury in the first place. So we're looking to include things like goalkeeper specific change of direction, acceleration, getting on and off the floor, having effective range of motion to be able to do so, and the introduction of hockey specific drills into the week before a full return to sport. And that's that very end stage return where we're looking to actually complete a full training week without any issues, being able to do all the movements that are required, specifically being able to do the movement itself that caused the injury, which in her case was cutting and moving laterally. So just making sure we've ticked off all of those boxes as well, making sure it's very, very specific to your sport is massively, massively important. So going straight from a rehab exercise to full gameplay is a recipe for disaster, because if you think about it, if you're doing isolated muscle movements, isolated range of motion exercises, isolated quadricep strengthening exercises, and then you're a footballer, you're out on the pitch and suddenly you've got to do a high speed change of direction, 90-degree cut, the rate of force development and the total amount of force that knee is experiencing is significantly higher than a single leg extension. So we've got to make sure that we build and build and build the foundations so that when we come to the end stage, we're capable of doing those movements. So we're not going to put ourselves at massive risk. And if you avoid these mistakes, you'll give yourself the best chance of staying injury free. So these are the key things to avoid, and here's how we can change this and make a more effective rehab process to reduce your risk of secondary injury. Step one is delaying the return until at least 9 months. As we've said, if we can do that, we're going to drastically reduce the risk. There's no need to rush this process. Doing it properly means you can do it once and do it well, not rush it and do it twice, which would be the worst case scenario. We really, really do not want to do that again. Studies show that delaying your return to high impact sports to at least 9 months after surgery can reduce your risk of re-injury by as much as half. Some statistics demonstrate this can be as much as 80% reduction, but it depends on the statistical modeling that they've looked at. So what we can effectively say here is that if we can reduce that risk by 50% by delaying our return by a few more months, then it is well worth it, because we're going to be in a much stronger position to return safely. Track progress and ensure that your knee is ready. Don't just go by time. Use objective markers like strength tests, balance tests, and movement mechanics as well. It's really key that you're not just using time, that you're also using key criteria to inform decision making. Step 2, build symmetrical quadricep strength. Many athletes return to sport with one leg significantly weaker than the other, and you do see this a lot. You see a follow-up or secondary injury to the contralateral limb. In other words, the other leg gets injured simply because we've put so much emphasis on getting your injured leg strong that when it comes to going back to sport, the other leg, unfortunately, is now at risk. And that is sometimes why that can be a massive risk factor for secondary injury. Or what's happened is we've got movement compensations that haven't been addressed. So the other leg might be strong, but simply because you're moving in a different way, your mechanics haven't been addressed. You're moving very poorly and you're compensating, putting that other leg at more risk because you're relying on it more because you haven't got full confidence in the injured leg. So it could be a number of factors here. So the strength imbalance puts more stress on the reconstructed ACL, increasing the risk of re-injury. Every 1% improvement in quadricep strength reduces injury risk by 3%. So if we can make a huge improvement in quadricep strength, we can massively reduce risk as well. If we can use isokinetic testing if available, or simple single leg exercises, we can measure those strength differences. We can make a big difference. We can massively increase quadricep strength. Just make sure we're measuring these things rather than using guesswork. Prioritize single leg strength work, things like split squats, step ups, single leg press, and isolated quadricep strength exercises like single leg extensions. So you haven't got other joints contributing to the force being produced, is going to make a big difference. And continue to progress resistance at training even once you've returned to sport. A lot of the evidence would suggest that you have to continue a structured strength training protocol multiple times per week for at least 6 to 8 weeks at an absolute minimum after return to sport. Ideally, there should just be a continuation of a lifetime of good training habits to make sure we're reducing that risk when you have gone back. So even if you're strong enough to go back to the sport, it might be that you still got underlying risk. And if we're not continuing to strengthen over time, then we're going to put our limb at risk even months after return. Finally, then step 3 is passing functional return to sport tests. So you wouldn't drive a car without checking the brakes. So why return to sport without testing your knee? So athletes who pass a return to sport test are significantly less likely to re-injure their knee rather than those who simply go back after a time-based criteria like 3 months has passed, you can start running, 9 months has passed, you can go back to sport. It's important that yes, we have a time component to it, but secondly, that we have very, very clear return to sport testing, that we know what our key criteria are. Now, your rehab should include rate of force development testing, so single leg squat jumping and counter movement jump testing. What this is going to do is not just look at how much force you can produce, but how quickly you can produce the force, and if there's a difference between your left side and your right side. One of the key things that can happen is you're strong enough, or your symmetry is fairly similar on both sides, but the rate at which you produce force is quite different. So that's a massively important thing to do, both on a double leg and an isolated single leg jump as well. So we can look at both the capacity of each limb, but also the strategy of which you're moving. So what your mechanics are like in a single and a double leg jump. Secondly, hop testing, things like single leg hops, triple hops, crossover hops, and timed hop testing can be an effective way to measure our explosive power and stability. Now, one of the problems here is that if we just use hop testing, so things like single leg hops, triple hops, crossover hops, and timed hops for distance, can be used to measure stability and asymmetry. But one of the challenges here is that if we only measure hop testing in isolation, you could have symmetrical distances, but actually it could be caused by the fact that the non-injured leg is actually not functioning at full capacity yet. So it might be operating at 80 or 90%, and yet the scores look the same. So the symmetry is similar, but actually the absolute numbers themselves are also what we should be looking at, ideally compared to pre-injury numbers. An example of this could be someone achieves 1.5 meters on a single leg hop on both limbs, but actually the capability is of their non-injured side could be 1.8 meters. They just haven't got there yet because the system is slightly reduced having had this injury process. So we've got to make sure not just to use that asymmetry, but also to look at absolute numbers of the hop testing itself, pre-injury scores, and rate of force development and maximal strength testing as well. So we've got a holistic view of what the limb is capable of. Landing mechanics training as well, focusing on proper knee alignment when jumping and cutting is hugely, hugely important. And agility and sport-specific drills. So trying to replicate game-like movements before returning to full competition. I gave the example of a client of mine who's going through hockey goalkeeper-specific rehab. We've also got an outfield hockey player who's doing the same thing. And we've also got someone who's returning to yoga as well, and actually being able to get into full ranges and being able to teach those classes is massively, massively important. So you've got to be able to do the things which you need to be doing in the sport, not just functional, isolated exercises that don't necessarily have a replication of what the sport looks like. Before stepping back onto the pitch or court, work with a rehab professional to complete a full return to sport assessment. If you don't pass, then you're not ready. And it's important that you use those criteria to make sure that you've actually hit the key markers that you need to do to return safely. Recovering from an ACL is tough, but returning stronger and staying injury-free is the real victory because you've obviously gone through that process properly. You've taken your time doing it. You haven't tried to rush the process. You've been patient, and it all pays off if you can return to sport safely and effectively. If you've liked this, please do like and subscribe. And if you found the content valuable, pop a comment below and you can ask me anything you like. Very happy to give you some advice on your specific situation.